In the dim, fading light of a forgotten mansion nestled at the edge of a small southern town, a tale untold begins to unfold. The walls of this decaying structure seem to whisper stories of a time long past, a time when the powerful lived in the shadows of their own sins, and their darkest secrets were buried beneath layers of wealth, status, and influence. In the year 1865, when the nation was grappling with its own scars of war and the notion of freedom was still a distant dream for many, one of America's most revered presidents, whose legacy was built on the ideals of liberty and justice, harbored a secret so deep, it would forever stain his reputation. What would happen if, in the quiet corners of history, a leader who stood for the American dream also had the power to erase a part of that very dream, by silencing the lives of those he was meant to protect? As the years passed, this man, whose image was carefully sculpted into a symbol of national pride, buried his transgressions beneath the weight of his political success. But time, relentless in its pursuit of truth, would not let the secret remain hidden forever. And so, in the cold silence of this mansion, the echoes of his actions, betrayal, shame, and cruelty, continued to haunt the very walls that once protected him. This tale is one of those hidden corners, a piece of history few have dared to uncover. The mansion, which now stands empty and overrun with ivy and neglect, was once a place of power and fear. Its creaking floorboards tell the story of a president's hidden life, a life that intertwined with one that, in another era, would have been deemed impossible, a life lived in secret with a woman he called family, yet kept enslaved. It is here, behind the tarnished windows and broken doors, that the true extent of his dark past began to take form. The man at the heart of this scandal, whose name still echoes through the halls of American history, was a figure of monumental importance. His legacy, one that was both celebrated and revered, had always seemed invincible. Known for his leadership during a turbulent time, his policies had shaped the very fabric of the nation. He was a symbol of strength, a man of conviction, and for many, a beacon of hope in the face of a divided country. But what few knew, and what history had been so careful to hide, was the shocking truth about the woman in his life who would become the key to his downfall. This woman, the president's sister-in-law, was born into a world of oppression, like so many others. She was an enslaved woman, owned by the family that held such political power in the American South. For years, she lived under the same roof as the man who would eventually become her husband's brother-in-law. Their lives were tied together in a web of family, power, and an unspoken tension that simmered beneath the surface of their daily lives. No one outside their circle knew the full extent of the relationship they shared, but behind the closed doors of the mansion, a quiet but dangerous bond began to form. It wasn't love, at least not in the sense that most people would think of it. It was a bond born from a deep, unspoken need, one driven by the twisted dynamics of power and control. In a time when slavery still gripped the southern United States, this man, a leader in a country that proclaimed freedom, had taken a woman enslaved and subjugated by the very system he claimed to fight against, and used her in ways that defied the very ideals he supposedly upheld. His actions were not just a personal betrayal to his family, they were an assault on the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice that he had sworn to protect. But what was even more shocking than the affair itself were the children. There were 6 of them, 6 lives born of this unholy bond, kept in the shadows of a nation that had long ago turned a blind eye to the horrors of slavery. These children, whose existence was systematically erased from historical records, became the president's greatest secret. They were a symbol of everything that the public would not, or could not, acknowledge about the president's life. The question that haunted everyone who stumbled upon the faintest traces of this story was, how could a man, who fought so vehemently for a nation's freedom, betray the very principles of liberty in the most intimate and devastating way possible? In the years that followed, this scandal, hidden from the world, would only grow in significance. Though the president maintained his image as the great liberator, the truth began to slip through the cracks. Behind closed doors, his family worked to conceal the existence of the 6 children, children who had never been allowed to claim their rightful place in the world, whose very existence was an affront to the ideals their father had once vowed to protect. The mansion, now empty, seemed to hold the memories of those silenced lives. The rooms that once echoed with the laughter of children who had no voice, no identity, now stood quiet, cold, and forgotten. In these very halls, the children of the president and his enslaved sister-in-law had once lived. They were the ghosts of a time long past, their memories buried as deep as the mansion's foundations, unseen by the world outside. Their lives, marked by shame and silence, had become the president's deepest secret, a secret that, once uncovered, would shake the very foundation of American history. As the decades passed, the world moved on. The president's image remained largely untarnished, his legacy enshrined in the halls of history. But in the shadows, beneath the weight of his fame, the truth simmered, waiting to be discovered. The mansion, abandoned and forgotten, stood as a monument to the secrets of the past, and with it, the lives of the 6 children who had never been allowed to exist in the light of day. The world would never truly know who they were, or how their lives had been shaped by the sins of their father. The question remains, could it be that the very man who had fought for the freedoms of a nation had, in secret, crushed the lives of his own flesh and blood? What does this say about a nation that revered him, a nation that celebrated his leadership while turning a blind eye to the darkest aspects of his personal life? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many other secrets have been buried beneath the weight of history, never to see the light of day? It is a cold, uncomfortable thought to entertain, the idea that the very fabric of a nation's history might be built on a foundation of lies, cover-ups, and silences. But that is the story of this president, the story of a family kept in the shadows, and the story of 6 children whose names will never be known. This is the scandal that history has tried so hard to bury, a scandal that remains untold, just out of reach, in the quiet corners of America's past. The story begins in a time when the South was still reeling from the consequences of war, and the echoes of division were far from fading. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the country was a fractured land, trying to stitch itself back together after years of bloodshed and strife. The year is 1865, and in the midst of this fractured landscape, the man at the center of the mystery was one of the most prominent figures of the time. His name, now etched in the annals of history, is forever linked to the era of conflict, but also to the ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality. He was a man of influence, a president who guided the nation through one of its most turbulent periods. His rise to power had been marked by a combination of political skill, charisma, and a vision for a united country, a vision that, for many, symbolized the very essence of the American experiment. But as with so many stories hidden in the pages of history, his legacy was not as pure as it seemed. Beneath the polished facade of a leader dedicated to the cause of justice and unity, there lay a secret that, had it been known, would have shattered the image of a hero beloved by the nation. This man, hailed for his leadership in the fight against slavery, had not only turned a blind eye to the suffering of the enslaved but had also played a role in perpetuating that suffering in the most intimate of ways. At the heart of the scandal was his sister-in-law, a woman whose name would be lost to history for much of her life. She was born into a life of unimaginable hardship, a life of slavery, which was the grim reality for so many African Americans in the South. This woman, who had known nothing but servitude from the moment she was born, became entangled in the life of a man who, for all his political prowess, could never escape the sins of his own making. She was enslaved by his family, her life bound by the same system of oppression that he claimed to fight against. Their relationship was one of silence, hidden away from the prying eyes of society. She lived under his roof, subjected to the daily indignities of slavery, while the president, for all his public outcry against the institution, kept her in the shadows of his private life. He was a man who, in front of the public, spoke of the necessity of freedom and equality, yet behind closed doors, continued to participate in a system that denied these very ideals to people like his sister-in-law. As their relationship deepened, it became something more than mere servitude. It was a twisted bond born of power and submission, one where the lines between family and ownership became dangerously blurred. The president, for all his political power and moral convictions, was not immune to the corrupting influence of the world around him. This woman, a mere piece of property in the eyes of society, became something much more to him, though the truth of their connection would be hidden from history for years to come. Over time, this bond between the two grew stronger, more complicated, and more troubling. What started as an arrangement of convenience soon transformed into something far darker, far more insidious. Behind the closed doors of the president's home, a scandal was taking root, one that, if discovered, would threaten the very foundation of the country's moral fabric. The president, a man who spoke of freedom and human rights, was secretly involved with an enslaved woman, his sister-in-law, in a relationship that violated everything he claimed to stand for. But this was only the beginning of the story. The real shock came in the form of the children, 6 children, born of this illicit union, who would remain hidden from the world. These children, whose very existence threatened to unravel the president's carefully constructed image, would be swept under the rug of history, their names erased from the records. They were the proof of a betrayal so deep, it could never be acknowledged, not by the president, nor by the family, nor by the nation that revered him. The children's births, kept secret for as long as possible, marked the beginning of an effort to conceal the reality of what had occurred. These children, born of the president's affair with his sister-in-law, would have their very identities stolen from them. They would be denied a place in the historical narrative, erased from the annals of history as if they never existed. They were the forgotten lives, the children of a scandal so great that it could not be allowed to see the light of day. The president, now burdened by the weight of his secret, worked to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He continued to play the role of the beloved leader, the man who fought for the freedom of the enslaved, while in the quiet corners of his life, the reality of his actions stood in stark contrast to his public persona. His family, too, played their part in the deception, keeping the children hidden away, denying them a place in the world. They were ghosts, their existence known only to a select few, and their future uncertain. The president's public life remained untouched by the scandal. His political career continued to thrive, and he was hailed as a champion of freedom and equality. But behind the closed doors of his mansion, the truth festered, a festering wound that could not be healed. The children, whose lives were forever altered by the president's actions, were kept in the shadows, their identities concealed, their stories erased. This scandal, one of the darkest secrets in American history, would remain hidden for years, buried beneath the weight of the president's carefully constructed legacy. The truth was too dangerous to be allowed to surface, and so it remained locked away, a dark secret that few dared to acknowledge. The mansion, now abandoned and forgotten, stands as a silent testament to the lives that were lost to history, the children who were never allowed to exist in the light of day. The question remains, how many other secrets have been buried in the shadow of history, swept away by the tide of time, only to be forgotten? How many other stories of betrayal, cruelty, and silence have been hidden in the corners of the past, waiting to be uncovered? And how much of the history we know is built on the foundation of these forgotten truths? The president's actions, though buried for so long, have left a stain on his legacy. His name, once synonymous with freedom and justice, is now tied to a scandal that no one could have predicted. The children he fathered, though lost to history, represent a truth that is too difficult to face, a truth about the man who fought for the freedom of others, but denied it to his own flesh and blood. This is the story that history forgot, a story that will never truly be told, but one that will continue to haunt the halls of the mansion and the pages of American history. The quiet, undisturbed town in which the president's mansion stood had always seemed like a place untouched by the ravages of time. The landscape, a patchwork of rolling hills and sprawling plantations, appeared serene, almost idyllic, from a distance. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, a storm made not of weather, but of whispers and secrets. The mansion, though beautiful and grand, held within its walls a shadow so dark that it threatened to consume everything it touched. It was a secret that had festered in silence for years, a truth hidden away from the public, carefully concealed behind the closed doors of the family's estate. But even the most carefully guarded secrets cannot remain hidden forever, and in time, the whispers began. The first signs of this mystery began to emerge from the shadows when a few curious townspeople, drawn by the strange happenings within the mansion, began to speculate on the true nature of the relationship between the president and his sister-in-law. The rumors were slow to spread, but they were persistent, like the quiet rustling of leaves before a storm. The townspeople, always careful not to speak too openly, began to notice oddities in the president's household, strange comings and goings at night, hushed conversations, and an unusual level of secrecy surrounding the president's private life. At first, these whispers were dismissed as mere gossip. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, such rumors were nothing new. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder, and the nature of the relationship between the president and his sister-in-law became a subject of quiet speculation. The president, who had once been seen as a man of principle and righteousness, was now the subject of unspoken judgment. Behind the smiles and polite nods, people began to wonder, could the man who had led the nation to a new era of freedom have been living a life so contrary to the values he had championed? It was not just the people of the town who noticed these strange occurrences. There were others, too, historians, scholars, and outsiders who began to piece together fragments of information, trying to make sense of the growing mystery. Letters, diaries, and family records, often hidden away in dusty archives or forgotten attics, became the first clues in a puzzle that no one was prepared to solve. It was in these documents that the first signs of the president's secret life began to emerge, faint, almost imperceptible hints of a hidden affair, of an illicit relationship with his sister-in-law, and, most shockingly, of 6 children whose existence had been carefully erased from the pages of history. The letters, written in the careful, precise script of a bygone era, spoke of private meetings and exchanges between the president and his sister-in-law, though the language was always veiled in ambiguity. In one letter, the president referred to his sister-in-law in a way that seemed far more intimate than the usual familial affection. In another, there were references to her being protected under his roof, though the true meaning of these words was shrouded in secrecy. The more these letters were examined, the clearer it became that the relationship between the two had transcended the bounds of what was considered acceptable, even in the most forgiving of times. But these were not the only clues that began to surface. There were also whispered accounts from those who had lived and worked within the president's household, people who had seen things they could not fully understand at the time but who now began to question what they had witnessed. A former servant, an elderly woman whose memory had begun to fade but whose words still carried weight, recalled how the president's sister-in-law had been treated with a strange combination of reverence and fear. She spoke of the way the president would disappear into her quarters late at night, always under the cover of darkness, and how the children, those mysterious children who seemed to vanish without a trace, would be kept out of sight from the rest of the household. According to this servant, there were times when she would hear sounds, children's laughter, faint cries, that seemed to come from deep within the mansion, from places where the family's social circle was never allowed to enter. For years, the mystery of these children remained unspoken, locked away in the recesses of the mansion's darkest rooms. The president's family, protective of their patriarch's public image, did everything in their power to ensure that the truth never reached the public eye. They were determined to maintain the illusion of a perfect family, one that had suffered enough from the turmoil of the war without the added burden of scandal. But no amount of denial could stop the truth from slipping through the cracks. The very fabric of the family's carefully constructed reality was beginning to unravel, and those who had once been content to ignore the whispers were now forced to confront them. As the mystery deepened, so too did the sense of foreboding that surrounded the mansion. The children, whose names had been carefully erased from history, became a symbol of the scandal that no one was brave enough to face. The more the whispers spread, the more it became apparent that the president's family was hiding something so significant that it could never be acknowledged in public. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, no one dared to speak the truth aloud. The public, loyal to the president and his legacy, refused to acknowledge the possibility that their beloved leader had harbored such a dark secret. But as the years passed, the truth began to gain traction. Researchers, historians, and even local townspeople who had heard the faintest hints of the story began to connect the dots. The president's life, once held up as a shining example of moral rectitude, began to look far less pristine under the light of scrutiny. The mystery of his sister-in-law, of their hidden relationship, and of the 6 children who had been erased from history began to form a narrative that threatened to challenge everything that had been believed about the president. Some of the first to speak out were the descendants of the president's extended family. Over time, they grew increasingly uncomfortable with the silence that had been imposed on the memory of those children. Though the details of the scandal were still shrouded in secrecy, some family members began to share what they knew, or at least what had been passed down through generations in hushed whispers. Their accounts, fragmented and often contradictory, painted a picture of a family desperate to protect its name, willing to go to great lengths to ensure that the president's hidden life remained buried. For them, the very idea of acknowledging the existence of the children was unthinkable. It would mean the destruction of the carefully constructed myth of the president's moral grandeur. But as time wore on, those who had once remained silent began to question the legacy they had inherited. Was it possible, they wondered, that the man they had been taught to revere was not the hero they had imagined? Could it be that his public crusade for freedom and equality had been nothing more than a facade, a mask to hide the truth of his personal life? For the first time, the narrative of the president's life seemed to falter. The carefully curated story of a man who had fought for the rights of others began to fall apart in the face of the mounting evidence of his own transgressions. The growing mysteries surrounding the president's hidden family eventually reached the ears of more determined historians, individuals committed to uncovering the full truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. These historians scoured the archives, combing through every document, every letter, every fragment of information that could shed light on the president's private life. It was through their relentless pursuit of the truth that the full scope of the scandal began to emerge. They pieced together the fragmented accounts of the president's affair with his sister-in-law and the subsequent birth of the 6 children, their lives erased from history. The historians could only wonder, how many more such secrets had been hidden, covered up, or buried under the weight of political and social power. The more the truth was uncovered, the more it became clear that this scandal, though long buried, would never truly be forgotten. The whispers that had once seemed like idle gossip had grown into a full-blown investigation, one that threatened to expose the very fabric of the president's carefully constructed image. The question now was no longer whether the truth would come out, but what the consequences would be when it finally did. Would the nation be able to reconcile the image of the beloved leader with the reality of his actions? Or would the discovery of his darkest secret shatter the idealized version of his legacy forever? In the quiet of the mansion, the truth continued to echo through the rooms, reverberating through the walls, waiting for the moment when it would finally be acknowledged. The whispers, once faint and barely noticeable, had become undeniable, and the secrets that had been buried for so long were on the verge of being brought into the light. The scandal that had remained hidden for so many years was no longer something that could be ignored. The past, it seemed, had a way of catching up with the present, no matter how hard one tried to bury it. As the years rolled on and the whispers of scandal began to stir the quiet air of the town, the mystery surrounding the president's hidden life began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't long before the first brave few began to speak up, their voices trembling with fear but tinged with a strange sense of determination. They were not the well-known historians or the ambitious researchers who would later dedicate their lives to uncovering the president's secret, but ordinary townsfolk, people who had witnessed things they couldn't quite understand at the time but who now, in the face of growing rumors, felt an unsettling need to speak. These were the first witnesses, servants, caretakers, and neighbors, who had seen the delicate threads of the family's web start to unravel. One of the first to speak out was an elderly woman who had once worked as a servant in the president's home. She had been a young girl at the time, caught in the whirlwind of a family far too grand and powerful to notice the small hands that served them. She had seen many things, most of them small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but some of them, as she grew older, took on a darker, more profound meaning. She recalled the late-night sounds, the soft footfalls of someone sneaking through the halls, the almost imperceptible creak of doors opening and closing when no one was supposed to be awake. In the stillness of the house, she had often heard the muffled voices of the president and his sister-in-law, speaking in low tones, too soft for her to understand, but unmistakable in their familiarity. Their voices, she remembered, were filled with a closeness, an intimacy that was completely at odds with the public image of the family. This woman, now in her twilight years, shared what she had seen, piecing together fragments of memories that had once seemed inconsequential but now felt more like missing puzzle pieces in a much larger story. She spoke of how the president would often slip away from his family's gatherings, retreating into the darkened corners of the house. In her quiet, matter-of-fact manner, she told of the many nights the president would disappear into his sister-in-law's rooms, rooms always kept locked, rooms where no one was ever allowed to enter. It was as though the mansion itself was hiding a secret so dark that the very walls seemed to absorb it, shielding the truth from the eyes of the world. The woman's stories were met with disbelief by some, but others, those who had long suspected there was more to the president's life than met the eye, began to take notice. It wasn't long before another account surfaced, this one from a neighbor who had watched the president and his sister-in-law from a distance, curious about the strange dynamics within the household. This neighbor, a man who had lived next door for decades, had seen the president's visits to his sister-in-law's quarters, though he had always chalked them up to familial concern. But there was something in the way the two interacted, something that felt unsettling. The way the president would linger just a bit too long, the way he seemed to have an odd tenderness toward her that went beyond what would be expected from a brother-in-law. There were also the times when he would bring food or medicine late at night, things that seemed innocuous but, in retrospect, seemed far too intimate to be normal. The more these early accounts surfaced, the more the story began to form. A pattern emerged, one that was at once disturbingly clear and still shrouded in mystery. The president, a man who was adored by the public, who had built his career on fighting for freedom, was deeply entrenched in a relationship that contradicted everything he had ever stood for. His sister-in-law, a woman enslaved by his family, had become more than just a mere servant, she had become a woman hidden away in the president's private life, her existence a well-kept secret that no one dared to speak about. And now, those who had once served in his household were beginning to connect the dots, sharing what they had seen with a mixture of trepidation and guilt, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. But as these accounts continued to trickle out, another layer to the story began to emerge. The children, those 6 children whose existence had been erased from history, began to surface in the conversations of the older townsfolk. Some claimed they had seen the children, though never in public, never in daylight. These children were not allowed to roam freely like the other children of the town. They were kept in the shadows, hidden away in the house, only emerging in the dead of night when the streets were empty and the world outside was fast asleep. The townspeople would occasionally catch glimpses of them from a distance, pale, quiet faces peering through the windows of the mansion, their eyes filled with an eerie sadness, as though they understood their place in the world was one of perpetual hiding. The strange thing about these children, though, was that no one could ever quite remember when they had first appeared, nor could they say with certainty how many there were. Some spoke of 3 children, others of 4, and still others mentioned a total of 6, though none of them could say for sure. The inconsistencies in their accounts only served to add to the mystery, making the whole affair feel like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. Were the children real, or were they merely a product of gossip and speculation, fueled by the strange aura that had surrounded the president's home? And if they were real, where had they come from, and why had they been kept hidden? For years, the truth remained elusive. The whispers were dismissed by many as nothing more than the idle chatter of a small town, eager to find scandal in the lives of those who seemed too perfect. The president's public image remained untarnished, and the family worked tirelessly to keep the secret buried. The children, if they were indeed real, were never acknowledged, their lives left to be lived in the shadows of a world that would never know them. The scandal, though whispered about by a few brave souls, remained mostly a footnote in the larger narrative of history. The president, for all his moral contradictions, continued to be celebrated as a hero. But as with all secrets, the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how carefully it is hidden. Over time, the witnesses, emboldened by the quiet passage of years and the increasing awareness of their own complicity in the silence, began to speak more openly. They were no longer content to let the past remain buried beneath the weight of tradition and fear. Some even approached historians, providing fragments of their memories, unsure of what would come of their words but unwilling to let the truth die with them. Slowly but surely, these accounts began to find their way into the hands of those who were dedicated to uncovering the buried truths of the past. The question was no longer whether the president had been hiding something. By now, it was clear that he had. The question was how far the deception had gone, and how much of it had been covered up in the name of protecting the president's legacy. What had truly happened within the walls of the mansion? What role had the president's sister-in-law played in the events that had led to the births of the 6 children? And most haunting of all, why had these children been erased from the history books? What lengths had been taken to ensure that their lives, and the scandal they represented, would never see the light of day? The growing pile of accounts, the strange behavior of the family, and the missing pieces of the president's legacy painted a picture that was far from the idealized version of history. Slowly but surely, the veil of secrecy began to lift, and with it came the heavy weight of truth. But the deeper the mystery was unraveled, the more questions seemed to emerge. The silence surrounding the president's hidden family, once impenetrable, was now cracking. And as each new witness came forward, the story grew more complicated, and more unsettling, than anyone had ever imagined. As the whispers surrounding the president's hidden family began to grow louder, the reaction from the public and the higher echelons of society was one of shock, denial, and swift suppression. It was as if a fragile facade was slowly being peeled back, revealing the cracks beneath. The narrative that had been carefully constructed over decades, a narrative of a man who had fought valiantly for freedom, equality, and the moral progress of the nation, was now in jeopardy. The family, desperate to protect the image of the patriarch, began to move swiftly, attempting to silence those who dared speak out about the disturbing truth. For a time, the attempts to suppress the growing rumors were successful. The president's family worked tirelessly to cover up the scandal, attempting to quash the accounts of the few witnesses who had begun to speak. Local authorities, often sympathetic to the powerful, acted as gatekeepers, ensuring that the truth did not find its way into the public sphere. Those who dared to speak of the president's private life were threatened, discredited, or even intimidated into silence. It was a battle of power against truth, and the forces of denial were formidable. The social circles in which the president had once been revered began to close ranks. Prominent figures in politics and high society, those who had been loyal to him for years, rallied to his defense, quickly dismissing the rumors as unfounded or the product of a small town's idle gossip. The narrative that had been constructed around the president's public image was too important to be tainted by such damaging rumors. To acknowledge the scandal would be to tear apart the very fabric of the nation's reverence for the president's legacy. There was too much at stake, too much invested in the myth of the man who had led the country through its darkest hour. At the heart of this denial was the idea that the president had been a symbol of moral leadership, a beacon of light during one of the most challenging periods in American history. To acknowledge that he had secretly betrayed the very ideals he professed would be to unravel a core belief held by many Americans. The public's admiration for the president was more than just an appreciation for his leadership, it had become a pillar of the national identity itself. The thought of this pillar collapsing under the weight of scandal was a terrifying prospect, one that many were simply not ready to face. For the president's family, this was not just a matter of personal disgrace, it was a matter of national pride. The family had long understood the importance of maintaining appearances, of ensuring that their patriarch's legacy remained untarnished. They were not just protecting the reputation of one man, they were protecting a symbol of the nation's ideals. In their eyes, the truth about the president's secret life was not just a personal matter, it was a threat to the moral and political stability of the country. The notion of their patriarch's actions being exposed was simply too dangerous to allow. The strategy to suppress the truth, however, was not without its complications. The growing number of witnesses who had spoken out, coupled with the mounting evidence that suggested something far darker had taken place within the president's household, could not easily be dismissed. The accounts were becoming too numerous, too detailed, to ignore. The president's once solid reputation began to show signs of cracking, and with each new revelation, the walls of secrecy that had been erected around his life seemed to weaken. The family's suppression efforts were not confined to threats or intimidation alone. There were more subtle, insidious methods employed to ensure that the truth remained buried. Documents were destroyed, letters erased, and any traces of the children's existence were systematically eliminated from public view. It was as if a great eraser had been applied to history, wiping away any evidence that could lead to the president's downfall. Archives were carefully curated, records altered, and anything that might have tied the president to the children was swept away, either lost to time or purposefully hidden from view. The president's family understood the power of memory and narrative. By controlling what was remembered and what was forgotten, they could control the story, and the story they wished to tell was one of greatness, not scandal. Despite their efforts, the children, those 6 silent lives who had been hidden away, remained an undeniable part of the equation. No matter how much the family tried to erase them from the historical record, there was an inescapable truth: they had existed. The very fact that they had been concealed for so long only made them more poignant, more tragic. They were the living, breathing proof of the president's betrayal, and no amount of suppression could change that. In the years that followed, their absence from the public narrative became its own form of indictment. Their silence, the erasure of their names, was the clearest sign of the lengths to which the family had gone to bury the truth. The president's sister-in-law, too, was a figure who could not be easily erased from history, though her name had been obscured for so long. Those who remembered her spoke of a woman who had borne the brunt of the president's actions, whose very existence had been controlled and suppressed by those around her. She had been forced into silence, her fate tied inexorably to the secrecy that surrounded her life. The president's actions had not only robbed her of her dignity but had also robbed her of the ability to live openly in a world that was rapidly changing. As the years passed, she remained a shadow in the background, her story a footnote in the larger narrative of the president's life, a woman whose silence became both her punishment and her protection. Yet, the president's family did not remain immune to the growing pressure. Over time, some family members, once steadfast in their defense of the patriarch, began to crack under the weight of the secret. The strain of maintaining such a colossal lie began to erode the family's unity. The mental and emotional toll of keeping the truth hidden for so long took its toll on the president's children and relatives. Some began to question the righteousness of their actions. What had been done in the name of preserving the president's legacy was, in the end, a distortion of the very ideals he had fought to uphold. The moral contradictions that had once been hidden in the shadows were now coming into sharp relief, and the silence that had been enforced for so long began to feel like a betrayal of its own. The breakdown of this silence was not sudden, it was a gradual erosion. First, it was small cracks in the family's unity, whispers exchanged in hushed tones between cousins, late-night conversations filled with uncomfortable questions. Then, more formal inquiries began to surface, spurred on by the growing sense of injustice that permeated the air. The descendants of the president's extended family, no longer willing to remain complicit in the cover-up, began to speak out, not just in private, but in public as well. They began to challenge the family's narrative, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies in the stories they had been told for generations. The reality of the president's actions was too great to ignore, and those who had once been silent found their voices. Some of the president's family members even began to speak with historians, providing pieces of the puzzle that had been carefully concealed for so long. They knew that the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The legacy of the president, they realized, could not be protected by maintaining a lie. The family understood, at last, that the preservation of their history could not come at the expense of justice, of acknowledging the suffering and silence that had been imposed upon the president's sister-in-law and their hidden children. In speaking out, they hoped to break the chains of secrecy that had held them all captive for so long. But even as the truth slowly began to find its way into the open, the president's legacy was not easily shattered. The myth of the man who had led the nation to victory in a civil war, who had fought for liberty and equality, was still deeply ingrained in the hearts of many. For some, the truth about his personal life would never be enough to overshadow the broader achievements that defined his presidency. But for others, the revelation of his hidden life, his betrayal of the very values he had championed, would forever taint the memory of the man they had once admired. In the end, the president's secret family was no longer just a scandal, it became a symbol of the complex, often painful intersection of personal lives and public legacies. The attempts to suppress the truth had failed, and the family's silence had finally been broken. But the question remained, could the nation reconcile the image of the beloved leader with the reality of his actions, or would this scandal forever cast a shadow over his legacy? As the mounting pressure to confront the scandal surrounding the president's secret family became more unavoidable, attempts to rationalize the president's actions began to emerge from unexpected quarters. His defenders, those who had long seen him as a moral beacon in a divided nation, began to seek explanations that might protect his legacy while acknowledging, at least in part, his transgressions. These rationalizations came in many forms, some based in the context of the time, others driven by an almost desperate need to preserve the ideals the president had once embodied. At the forefront of these attempts was the argument that the president, in a deeply divided society struggling with the aftermath of the Civil War, had made choices that were, in some ways, reflective of the deeply entrenched power structures that still held sway over American society. This argument contended that the president's involvement with his sister-in-law, though morally questionable by modern standards, was rooted in the pervasive culture of slavery, where personal relationships and power dynamics were inextricably linked to the oppression of others. It was a time when even the most progressive-minded individuals often found themselves trapped by the very systems they sought to dismantle, and so, the theory went, the president's actions might be seen as a product of a much larger, more intractable societal ill. There were others who tried to frame the president's affair with his sister-in-law as a tragic consequence of the intense pressure he faced during his presidency. Having steered the nation through one of its darkest periods, fighting for ideals of freedom and equality, it was argued, the president may have been driven to make decisions that were, in a way, human, in their complexity and moral contradictions. Some historians and intellectuals believe that his private life, in this narrative, could not be neatly separated from the public persona he had cultivated. The demands placed on him by history, it was suggested, may have blurred his sense of right and wrong, pushing him toward actions he would have otherwise abhorred. This theory painted the president not as a villain, but as a tragic figure caught in the contradictions of his own time. Despite these efforts to frame his actions within the context of his historical moment, there was an undeniable tension that ran through these explanations, a tension between the desire to protect the president's image and the painful truth that his choices had irreparably harmed others. It was not just the fact that he had maintained a secret relationship with his sister-in-law that weighed heavily on the narrative, but the darker implications of that relationship, the children who had been born of it, and the fact that they had been deliberately hidden from history. These were the children whose very existence threatened to unravel everything the president stood for, and they were the key to understanding the true moral decay at the heart of the scandal. As more pieces of the puzzle began to emerge, so too did the realization that attempts to explain away the president's actions were falling short. The stories of the children, born in secret and denied the right to exist in the public eye, painted a picture of a man who had, in his quest for power and idealism, lost sight of the very principles he had once fought for. There was no longer any question that the president had betrayed the very ideals of freedom and equality that had defined his presidency. The revelation of his hidden family, in many ways, became a symbol of the broader contradictions within American society, a society that proclaimed freedom for all, but whose systems of power and race often denied it to those who needed it most. The most devastating aspect of the scandal, however, was not the betrayal of the president's public image, but the psychological toll it had taken on those who were directly involved, the children. Born into a world where their existence was a carefully guarded secret, these children grew up in the shadow of an enormous lie, their lives defined not by the love and recognition they deserved but by the silence that surrounded them. Even if they had never known the full extent of the scandal, they were born into a legacy that would forever be marked by secrecy and shame. For these children, their very identities were suppressed. They were denied the right to know their own history, to understand who they were in the context of the family they had been born into. Their mother, the president's sister-in-law, had been forced into silence as well, kept out of the public eye and confined to the shadows of the mansion. She, too, was denied the dignity of being acknowledged as anything more than a quiet figure in the background, a footnote in a much larger, much more powerful story. The children, however, were not simply lost to history, they were systematically erased. Their names, their birth records, and the evidence of their existence were all deliberately concealed, as though they had never been born. The president's family, determined to protect the patriarch's legacy, had hidden them away from the public, treating them as if they were ghosts, creatures who did not deserve to live in the light of the world. But the psychological scars of such an existence could not be so easily hidden. The more these children's stories emerged, the more it became clear that their lives had been marked by a deep and lasting trauma. To be born into secrecy, to grow up without the knowledge of your own heritage or the ability to claim your place in history, was a psychological burden that no child should ever have to bear. Their existence had been denied, and in doing so, they had been robbed of their agency, their dignity, and, perhaps most tragically, their identity. As the accounts of those who had witnessed the president's hidden family continued to surface, it became clear that the impact of the scandal extended far beyond the immediate family. The town itself, once a quiet and peaceful community, had become a site of collective moral reckoning. The story of the president's betrayal and the lives of the children he had abandoned cast a long shadow over the town. People who had once been content to remain silent now found themselves questioning the very fabric of their society. How had they allowed such a dark secret to remain hidden for so long? How had they, as individuals and as a community, allowed themselves to turn a blind eye to the suffering that had been inflicted in their midst? There was a growing sense of guilt and complicity among the townspeople. Many of them had known, or at least suspected, that something was amiss in the president's household, but they had chosen to remain silent. The fear of disrupting the idealized image of the president and his family had been too great. They had, in a way, been complicit in the cover-up, choosing to protect the illusion of moral righteousness over confronting the uncomfortable truths that lay just beneath the surface. But now, as the truth came to light, they could no longer ignore the moral cost of their silence. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the scandal surrounding the president's hidden family was not just a personal betrayal but a reflection of the broader moral and social issues that had plagued America for centuries. The president's actions, in many ways, mirrored the contradictions at the heart of the nation itself. The country had been founded on the principles of liberty and equality, yet those ideals had never been extended to all people. The president's affair with his sister-in-law, the birth of his secret children, and the subsequent erasure of their existence were not isolated events, they were emblematic of the systemic oppression that had been woven into the very fabric of American society. And so, the scandal took on a life of its own, growing into a larger story of injustice, betrayal, and the long-lasting consequences of silence. The questions that arose were no longer just about the president's personal failings. They became questions about the nation's moral foundation. What does it mean to live in a country that claims to uphold the ideals of freedom and justice, but where those ideals are so often denied in practice? What does it say about a society that is willing to erase the lives of its most vulnerable citizens in order to protect the image of those in power? The president, in the end, could not escape the consequences of his actions, no matter how much his family tried to shield him. The truth, as it always does, found a way to rise to the surface, and with it came the weight of history's judgment. The president's legacy, though still revered by some, would forever be marked by the scandal of his hidden family, a scandal that, no matter how much it was suppressed or ignored, could never truly be erased. As the truth surrounding the president's secret family began to ripple outward, it set in motion a cascade of events that no one could have predicted. The public, for the first time, found themselves forced to reckon with the ugly contradictions of the man they had once revered. His leadership during a tumultuous time, his advocacy for freedom and equality, all of it now seemed like a cruel irony, a mask that had concealed the darkness of his personal life. The affair with his sister-in-law and the hidden children he had abandoned were no longer mere rumors whispered in the corners of society. They had become undeniable truths, backed by a growing body of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Yet, even with all the facts now exposed, there remained an air of disbelief that hung over the president's story. The gap between the idealized public image of the man and the grim reality of his private life was too vast, too incongruous for many to accept. For those who had once been loyal to him, there was a deep sense of betrayal, a loss of the guiding moral figure they had once placed their trust in. But there was also a more profound and unsettling question that arose. Could the man who had done so much for the country in its darkest hour truly be as corrupt and morally flawed as his personal actions now suggested? This was not a simple question, and it did not have a simple answer. For some, the president's private life would always be an uncomfortable blemish, a dark chapter in the otherwise noble story of his leadership. But for others, the discovery of his hidden family shattered the very foundation of their admiration. It was a cruel paradox. How could a man who had fought for the liberty and equality of others be so willing to deny the most basic human rights to those closest to him? The scandal forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable reality that even its most revered leaders were not beyond reproach, that the idealized version of the past could not withstand the weight of inconvenient truths. The fallout was not just confined to the president's personal legacy, but to the legacy of the nation itself. For years, the country had prided itself on its commitment to freedom, on its dedication to the idea that all men were created equal. But how could these ideals coexist with a reality where those in positions of power continued to perpetuate systems of control, domination, and secrecy? The president's affair with his sister-in-law and the subsequent erasure of their children from the historical record became a painful metaphor for the hypocrisy at the heart of American society, a society that, while espousing lofty ideals, continued to perpetuate the same systems of oppression it claimed to be fighting against. In the years following the revelation of the president's secret family, scholars and historians began to sift through the details of his life, looking for answers to the many questions that still lingered. Some sought to understand the psychological motivations behind his actions, how a man who had fought so hard for the rights of others could be capable of such personal betrayal. Others focused on the broader implications of his behavior, examining how his actions reflected the larger moral and social contradictions that had defined American history for centuries. One prevailing theory, shared by many scholars, was that the president's actions were a result of the immense pressure he faced as a leader during one of the nation's most turbulent periods. The Civil War, the divisive political landscape, and the constant strain of leadership may have contributed to a breakdown in his moral clarity. In this interpretation, the president's private life was a reflection of his struggles with the immense burden of his public responsibilities. He had been a man pushed to the brink, a man whose personal failings had become intertwined with the very ideals he had once championed. The affair with his sister-in-law, the birth of the children, and the subsequent efforts to conceal them were seen as symptoms of a man grappling with a fractured sense of identity, lost in the complexity of his own conflicting values. However, not all historians were willing to offer such a charitable reading of the president's actions. For some, the president's affair was indicative of a deeper moral failing, one that could not be explained away by the pressures of leadership or the complexities of his time. The affair, in their view, was an act of betrayal not just to his family, but to the very principles he had once espoused. His failure to acknowledge the existence of his children, to erase their lives from history, spoke to a deep-seated hypocrisy that could not be ignored. In this interpretation, the president's actions were not a tragic consequence of the times in which he lived, but rather a reflection of a man who had failed to live up to the ideals he had preached. For those who had known the president personally, the revelations were equally unsettling. There were some who, upon hearing the truth, were quick to defend him, insisting that his actions, while morally reprehensible, did not negate the great work he had done as a leader. But there were others who could not reconcile the man they had admired with the man who had betrayed his own family. These former allies, disillusioned and heartbroken, struggled to come to terms with the fact that the man they had once seen as a beacon of moral righteousness was, in reality, far more flawed than they had ever imagined. At the heart of this moral reckoning was the realization that the president's actions had far-reaching consequences. The children he had hidden away, erased from history, were not mere victims of their father's actions, they were symbols of the systemic erasure of those who had been marginalized for centuries. The president's decision to conceal them, to deny their right to exist in the public eye, was not an isolated act of personal betrayal, it was a manifestation of the broader societal forces that had long silenced the voices of the oppressed. These children, born into secrecy and denied their place in history, became symbols of a much larger, much more insidious legacy, a legacy of inequality, power and control. The question of the president's legacy became inextricably tied to the question of how society should reckon with its past. Could the nation continue to revere a man who had done so much for the country, despite his deeply flawed personal life? Was it possible to separate the president's public achievements from his private failings? And perhaps most importantly, what did it mean to honor a legacy built on ideals of freedom and equality when the very foundations of that legacy were built upon the silencing and erasure of others? As the years went on, the debate surrounding the president's legacy became more intense. Historians, scholars, and politicians weighed in, each offering their own interpretation of his actions and their broader implications. Some called for a re-evaluation of the president's place in history, urging the public to see him as a complex, morally conflicted figure, a man who, despite his flaws, had still accomplished great things. Others, however, argued that the president's private failings could not be so easily overlooked. They believed that his actions, particularly toward his children, revealed a man who had betrayed the very principles he had fought for, and that this betrayal should not be excused. In the end, the legacy of the president became a fractured, contested narrative, one that could not be easily reconciled or neatly packaged. For some, he remained a hero, a tragic figure whose personal life had been tainted by the same forces of power and control that had shaped the nation. For others, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most revered figures were not beyond reproach. And for those who had suffered because of his choices, the children he had abandoned, the family he had betrayed, the question remained, how could they ever find peace in a world that had erased their existence for so long? The scandal, in the end, was not just about the president. It was about the nation itself, the contradictions at the heart of its ideals, the ways in which power and oppression had shaped the lives of those who were never meant to be seen or heard. And in this sense, the legacy of the president, for better or for worse, was inseparable from the larger story of America's struggle with its own identity, its own values, and the painful truths it had long sought to suppress. As the scandal surrounding the president's secret family continued to unfold, attempts to make sense of the unfolding drama began to take on a new direction. While the country grappled with its disillusionment, scholars and the public alike were forced to confront the deeper layers of the story, an examination of how the past, once buried, came to affect the present in ways that were far from over. The question wasn't just about the president's actions in his lifetime, but also about the legacy he left behind, the echoes of his choices reverberating through time. His decisions were not mere personal failings, they were emblematic of a wider societal and historical context that had allowed such acts to go unchallenged, unacknowledged, for so long. The children who had been hidden from history were now at the heart of the debate. For years, their existence had been erased, their lives suppressed, and their identities never allowed to take shape in the collective memory of the nation. Now, as the world learned about them, there was a quiet but undeniable realization that their very existence was the key to understanding the full extent of the scandal, and perhaps even the key to understanding the nation's own uncomfortable relationship with its past. There were those who began to study the president's life in a new light. Rather than merely cataloging his achievements and moral failures, these scholars started looking at the hidden children as an untold story of their own, one that was inextricably tied to the larger narrative of American history. They delved into the psychological and social consequences of being erased from history, of growing up without the privilege of knowing one's own story, one's own place in the world. These children had been denied the right to belong, and as their story emerged, it became clear that they had been more than mere victims of a family's secrecy, they were the forgotten casualties of a system that had always denied them the same rights and recognition as others. The more the story of the hidden children was pieced together, the more it became clear that the president's actions could not be viewed as isolated or incidental. They were not just a betrayal of his own family, but a reflection of the larger forces at play in American society, forces that were rooted in power, race, and privilege. The children's erasure from history, their forced invisibility, was an act that mirrored the experiences of so many marginalized people throughout the country's history. They were silenced not only because of their parentage but because they were born into a world where their existence was deemed unworthy of acknowledgement. Yet the story of these children was not just one of suffering and denial. As their names, faces, and lives were slowly brought to light, a new narrative began to take shape, one that was driven by the resilience of those who had been forced into the shadows. The children who had once been silenced began to reclaim their own identities, to assert their right to be remembered. Slowly, a different story emerged from the shadows, a story of resistance and survival in a world that had sought to erase them, to forget they had ever existed. This reclaiming of identity was not only a matter of historical accuracy but also a matter of justice. By restoring their lives to the record, scholars, activists, and descendants of the president's family were also attempting to rewrite a history that had long been shaped by power and exclusion. This was no longer just about a disgraced president and his secret family, it was about the larger project of reckoning with the dark undercurrents of American history. It was about the need to confront the uncomfortable realities that had long been swept under the rug. The hidden children were no longer passive victims of a powerful family's cover-up, they had become symbols of a greater fight for recognition, justice, and acknowledgement. As the historical record began to fill in the gaps left by years of suppression, a sense of inevitability emerged. The president's legacy, once viewed through the lens of unquestionable greatness, was now a fragmented, more complex picture. His public image, the hero, the freedom fighter, the moral guidepost, was forever intertwined with the shame and guilt of his personal choices. His private life, once hidden in the shadows, was now being exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The president, for all his achievements, had been unable to escape the consequences of his actions, and the children he had abandoned were now at the center of the story, their lives reclaimed and acknowledged as an indelible part of his legacy. In this newfound scrutiny of his personal failings, many began to look at the social systems that had enabled the president's behavior. How had it been possible for such an affair, such a betrayal, to go unnoticed for so long? The answer lay not only in the secrecy of the president's family but in the larger structures of power that allowed the lives of the most vulnerable to remain hidden. The president's sister-in-law, enslaved and subjugated by her circumstances, had been treated as less than human, her existence erased as though it had no significance in the grand scheme of things. Her children, born of that hidden relationship, had been subject to the same fate, denied recognition, denied belonging, and denied the very right to exist in history. The deeper one dug into this story, the more it became apparent that the president's private actions were not simply an anomaly, they were a product of a system that had long been built on the exploitation and suppression of others. The president's affair with his sister-in-law and the children that resulted were, in many ways, the byproducts of a larger system of power and inequality that had been embedded in the very fabric of American society. The president himself, despite his public proclamations of liberty and equality, had been complicit in perpetuating this system, a system that denied full personhood to those who were born outside the lines of power, race, and privilege. But what, then, did it mean to reckon with the president's legacy? Could the country continue to revere him as a hero, despite his personal failings? Could history separate the man from his actions, the hero from the hypocrite? The answer to these questions was, and continues to be, elusive. What was clear, however, was that the president's story could no longer be viewed as a simple tale of moral triumph over adversity. The layers of complexity that had been buried for so long were now exposed, and with them, the truth about the nation's own contradictions. To reckon with the president's legacy was not just to assess his personal actions, but to confront the larger moral failures of the society he had inhabited. In the years following the exposure of the scandal, the public discourse surrounding the president shifted. The national narrative, once defined by admiration and reverence, began to give way to a more nuanced discussion of his life, his legacy, and the forces that had shaped his choices. The president was no longer a figure above reproach, he was now a symbol of the broader struggle for justice, a reminder that even the most exalted figures in history were capable of great moral failure. And in this moral failure, the president had become part of a much larger, much more painful conversation, one about the enduring consequences of inequality, power, and the erasure of those who had been silenced for too long. And so, the story of the president's secret family became more than just a scandal. It became a story of reckoning, of history confronting its own dark truths, of a nation forced to confront the ways in which it had failed to live up to its own ideals. The children, once erased from history, were now symbols of that reckoning. They were the ones who had survived in the shadows, who had been denied recognition, but who, in the end, had been given the justice they deserved. In reclaiming their story, they reclaimed not just their own identities but the right to be remembered as part of a larger history, one that could no longer be ignored or erased. The president's legacy, now forever intertwined with the scandal, remained a topic of heated debate. But as history continued to unfold, it became clear that the story of his secret family would never be forgotten. The children, born in secrecy and denied the right to exist in the light, had emerged from the shadows. And in doing so, they had forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been buried for so long.